Mitochondrial DNA tracks only the direct, unbroken maternal line, mother to mother to mother, stretching back across however many generations, separate a living person from a specific ancestor. Broader autosomal DNA, the kind measured by most consumer ancestry testing services, instead reflects the accumulated contribution of every ancestral line feeding into a person's family tree, both maternal and paternal, diluted and reshuffled anew with every single generation. A population can carry a strong measurable general genetic signal from a particular region across its whole genome, while that same region's specific maternal lineage remains comparatively underrepresented within the narrower, single-line mitochondrial record, and this appears to be at least part of what is happening in Jamaica specifically, where the whole genome Nigerian signal remains real and substantial, even as the narrower maternal mitochondrial evidence points most strongly toward the Gold Coast instead. What the maternal DNA evidence specifically shows is not that the Bight of Biafra connection is fictional or overstated in Jamaican cultural memory. It shows that the paper record and the biological record are each telling a true story that happens to be incomplete on its own, and that only by reading both types of evidence together, autosomal and mitochondrial, written record and genetic record, do you actually arrive at the fuller, more accurate picture of exactly how modern Jamaica's ancestry took shape across 2.5 centuries of forced migration, survival, and reproduction. For generations, the accepted story of where Jamaica's ancestors actually came from was written almost entirely from the perspective of the people who profited directly from forcing them onto ships in the first place, traders and colonial administrators counting cargo rather than counting the lives and eventual descendants of the people being transported. This body of genetic research represents one of the first serious efforts to check that inherited story directly against the biology of the actual descendants living today, rather than relying solely on the paperwork left behind by the traders themselves. It does not erase any part of Jamaica's well-documented, multi-regional African heritage. It adds an entirely new layer of evidence historians simply did not have access to before genetic sequencing. Technology matured enough to make this kind of analysis possible. Real biological proof of exactly which specific African ancestors most successfully passed their lineage forward across roughly 250 years of almost unimaginable hardship, survival, and quiet generational persistence. This was not a casual consumer ancestry kit, generating a rough percentage breakdown purely for personal entertainment. This was peer-reviewed demographic and population genetic research, published in the academic journal Slavery and Abolition, cross-referencing real Jamaican genetic samples directly against population-level reference data collected from West and Central Africa, specifically designed to test whether the genetic record actually matched the written historical shipping record or not, work that required careful statistical modeling to account for the reality that many African ethnic groups and regions share overlapping genetic signatures. Making the kind of clean, confident regional assignment, this research achieved a genuine methodological accomplishment in its own right. It was not the only research to examine this exact question either. A separate genetic study, published later in the journal BMC Ecology and Evolution, using an interdisciplinary approach combining historical demographic data with fresh mitochondrial DNA analysis, had already independently flagged the same striking pattern. At the level of maternal DNA, a substantial share of Jamaicans carried mitochondrial haplogroups most strongly associated specifically with the Gold Coast region, modern Ghana, the historic homeland of Akan-speaking peoples, not the Bight of Biafra, not the specific region the shipping manifests had pointed to as the largest single documented source of Jamaica's enslaved population. Two separate independently conducted lines of genetic evidence, using different sample sets and somewhat different methodologies, were both converging on the exact same uncomfortable disagreement with the written historical record. So, which record was actually telling the truth? Here is what the mitochondrial DNA data specifically showed once researchers ran the full analysis. Across the sampled population, maternal lineages traced overwhelmingly back to West Africa as a whole, a finding that matched the historical record perfectly and surprised absolutely nobody, since nobody seriously doubted that the vast majority of Jamaican ancestry traces back to West Africa in general. The genuine surprise sat one level deeper, in exactly which specific part of West Africa carried the strongest genetic signal. Instead of the Bight of Biafra, the specific region shipping records indicate sent the largest documented share of enslaved people to Jamaica overall. The Gold Coast region showed up as the dominant maternal genetic contributor by a meaningfully wide margin in both major studies. The Akan-associated genetic signature was not simply present in the data. It emerged as the single most represented regional maternal ancestry across the entire mitochondrial DNA pool of the modern Jamaican samples tested. That is the actual mismatch at the heart of this story. The paper trail says the Bight of Biafra should dominate Jamaica's African maternal ancestry. The DNA says the Gold Coast does instead. Researchers have proposed several possible explanations for exactly why this mismatch exists, and it is worth being genuinely honest that this remains an active, ongoing area of scholarly investigation rather than a single, fully settled question with one confirmed answer. One leading possibility involves differential survival and reproduction. The specific conditions faced by enslaved people transported from different African regions, arriving at different plantations during different specific decades of Jamaica's long colonial history, may not have translated evenly into equal numbers of surviving descendants centuries later, meaning a comparatively smaller original number of arrivals from one particular region could still, over many subsequent generations, leave a proportionally larger genetic footprint in the modern population than a numerically larger group that experienced higher mortality or lower rates of surviving childbirth. This possibility gains additional weight from a specific detail of Jamaica's demographic history that historians have long documented independently of any genetic evidence. The fact that Jamaica's enslaved population as a whole experienced a persistently negative rate of natural population growth for much of the 18th century, meaning deaths among the enslaved population regularly outpaced births, forcing plantation owners to rely on continuous fresh importation simply to maintain existing labor numbers rather than natural population increase. Against that grim demographic backdrop, later arrivals, including the large numbers of people forced from the Bight of Biafra and West Central Africa, specifically during the final, most intensive decades of the trade right before its abolition, would have had comparatively less time to establish surviving family lines before the trade itself ended, compared with earlier arriving populations, including many from the Gold Coast, who had correspondingly more generations available to establish descendants before the trade's abolition in 1807 cut off further importation entirely. A second possible explanation relates to a genuine limitation in the historical shipping records themselves, since manifests typically recorded a captive's specific point of embarkation on the African coast, not necessarily that person's true region or ethnic group of origin, meaning individuals labeled according to the specific port they were forced to board a ship from may, in a meaningful number of cases, have actually originated considerably further inland or from an entirely different ethnic group than the port itself would suggest. A third factor researchers have pointed to involves the specific demographic patterns surrounding enslaved women in particular. Since historical evidence suggests women from certain African regions may have been retained locally, sold onward to different destinations, or subjected to different survival conditions than men taken from those exact same regions, and because mitochondrial DNA tracks the maternal line exclusively, any significant regional imbalance specifically affecting enslaved women would directly and disproportionately shape which regional ancestry ends up showing the strongest signal in this particular kind of genetic test today, entirely independent of whatever the equivalent pattern might look like on the paternal side. None of this erases or contradicts the genuine, extensively documented historical role the Bight of Biafra and Igbo people specifically played in shaping Jamaica's history and culture. Igbo cultural influence on Jamaican language, folklore, cuisine, and broader tradition is well documented and entirely real, visible today in specific words absorbed into Jamaican patois and in cultural practices historians have traced directly back to Igbo origins. Separate genetic research examining commercial ancestry testing results and DNA matching patterns among Jamaican participants has also found a real, substantial, and unmistakable Nigerian genetic signal present in the broader whole genome ancestry of many Jamaicans, with average Nigerian-associated percentages in some independently compiled surveys of Jamaican commercial DNA, results running as high as 20% or more, distinct from the specifically maternal mitochondrial pattern the peer-reviewed academic studies focused on. It is worth being precise about why these two different types of genetic evidence can point in somewhat different directions without actually contradicting each other. Mitochondrial DNA tracks only the direct unbroken maternal line, mother to mother to mother, stretching back across however many generations, separate a living person from a specific ancestor. Broader autosomal DNA, the kind measured by most consumer ancestry testing services, instead reflects the accumulated contribution of every ancestral line feeding into a person's family tree. For nearly 2 centuries, one specific fact about Jamaica's African ancestry has been repeated in history books so consistently that almost nobody thought to question it. British shipping records, some of the most detailed commercial documentation ever kept of the transatlantic slave trade, clearly show that more enslaved people were forced onto ships bound for Jamaica from one particular stretch of the West African coast than from anywhere else. That region was the Bight of Biafra, homeland of the Igbo people. For generations, that single fact shaped the assumption that Igbo ancestry must be the largest African genetic contribution carried by Jamaicans today. It was printed in academic papers, repeated in documentaries, and treated as one of the more settled facts in the entire, often frustratingly incomplete field of transatlantic slave trade history. Then scientists actually went looking for that ancestry inside real Jamaican DNA, not inside a ship's cargo manifest, but inside the actual cells of living descendants, and the results did not confirm what 200 years of shipping paperwork had been saying. They contradicted it cleanly and repeatedly across more than one independent study. To understand why that contradiction matters so much, you first need to understand exactly how solid the paper trail actually was. Jamaica's population today is over 90% of African descent, one of the most concentrated African diasporas found anywhere on Earth. Between the late 1600s and the early 1800s, an estimated 1 million enslaved Africans were transported to Jamaica aboard British ships, making it one of the largest forced migrations to any single Caribbean colony in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. Because the British Empire maintained meticulous commercial records, cargo manifests, plantation ledgers, and detailed port logs, modern historians have been able to reconstruct, in genuinely remarkable detail, which specific stretches of the African coastline supplied the largest numbers of captives sent to any given colony. Work that has been consolidated over the past several decades into a single, enormous, publicly accessible research resource known as the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, drawing on records from tens of thousands of individual documented voyages across the entire history of the trade. Historians typically divide the West and West Central African coastline into a handful of major historical trading regions for this purpose: the Gold Coast, covering roughly modern Ghana, the Bight of Benin, spanning parts of modern Ghana, Togo, Benin and western Nigeria, the Bight of Biafra, covering the Niger Delta and the historic homeland of the Igbo, and Ibibio peoples, the Windward Coast and Sierra Leone, and West Central Africa, covering the Congo and Angola region. According to the shipping data compiled by historians and stored today in the widely used transatlantic slave trade database, a very large share of the people forced onto ships bound specifically for Jamaica during the 18th century embarked from the Bight of Biafra. It is one of the most well-documented patterns in the entire historical record of the transatlantic slave trade, and for generations it shaped the reasonable, evidence-based assumption that Igbo ancestry should represent the single largest African genetic contribution to the modern Jamaican population. That assumption was not a wild guess. It was built on real, extensive, carefully preserved commercial records, and nobody had a particularly strong reason to doubt it. But shipping records, however detailed, only ever tell you one specific thing: who got forced onto a boat at a specific port on a specific date. They cannot tell you who survived the brutal weeks-long crossing of the Atlantic. They cannot tell you who survived the horrific conditions of enslavement itself once they arrived. They cannot tell you who went on to have children, whose own children survived, and whose descendants are still alive today, 4, 5, 6, or more generations later. Between a single name entered onto a manifest in 1780 and a living Jamaican person in the 21st century sits centuries of biology, survival, reproduction, and demographic history that no paper record was ever capable of capturing. Only DNA can capture that. So a team of researchers set out to stop reading the shipping logs and start reading something the slave traders themselves never had any access to at all. The genetic material sitting quietly inside the cells of modern Jamaican people, and the specific region it pointed back toward, was not the one almost anyone studying this question was expecting to find. The most detailed version of this research analyzed mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively from mother to child, remaining essentially unchanged across thousands of years of maternal inheritance, collected from several hundred Jamaican individuals sampled from across the island. Researchers collected simple cheek swabs, extracted the DNA, and sequenced the mitochondrial control region for each participant, producing a specific genetic signature called a haplotype for every individual that could then be directly compared against reference genetic databases built from populations sampled across the African continent, databases assembled over years of separate population genetics research specifically documenting the mitochondrial diversity present across dozens of distinct West and Central African ethnic groups and regions. From there, the research went a meaningful step further than simply confirming that a given person's ancestry was African in general. The team built a formal admixture model, a statistical method designed to estimate, for each individual's specific maternal lineage, the most likely proportional origin across the 5 major historical African slaving coasts: the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the combined Windward Coast and Sierra Leone region, and West Central Africa. It is worth stepping back and appreciating just how unusual this kind of finding actually is within the broader field of historical population genetics, because it runs in the opposite direction from what most similar research typically uncovers. In case after case examined elsewhere in the world, genetic testing has tended to reveal that a community's own oral tradition, or a population's documented historical record, turns out to be less complete, or in some cases, considerably more complicated than the simple version everyone had assumed. Here, the shipping records were never wrong about the basic historical fact they were designed to document: that a very large number of people were indeed forcibly embarked from the Bight of Biafra, specifically bound for Jamaica during the 18th century. A well-documented, extensively researched, and entirely real historical fact in its own right. What the DNA reveals instead is a genuinely different kind of gap, not an error in the historical documentation itself, but a limitation in what that documentation was ever capable of measuring in the first place, since a ship's manifest can only ever record who boarded a vessel at a specific point in time, not who among that group survived long enough to become an ancestor of someone living 2.5 centuries later. That distinction between documenting an historical event and documenting its ultimate demographic legacy turns out to matter enormously. And this research stands as one of the clearest examples anywhere of exactly how much that distinction can actually change the picture once modern genetics gets involved. If you are of Jamaican or wider Caribbean descent, this research carries a genuinely personal weight worth sitting with directly. The version of your ancestry commonly taught through shipping records and historical documentation alone may only ever represent part of the real story, and the remainder of that story may already be sitting quietly inside your own DNA, waiting for the right kind of test to read it properly. This particular body of research focused specifically on the maternal line tracked through mitochondrial DNA passed down from mother to child. The paternal side of this same story, traced instead through Y chromosome DNA, passed down from father to son, tells its own separate and potentially quite different version of this exact same mismatch between documented history and biological legacy, and it remains a genuinely open question exactly how closely that paternal pattern will end up matching or diverging from what the maternal evidence has already revealed. There is a cultural and historical dimension to this genetic finding worth understanding as well, since it may itself form part of the explanation for why Gold Coast ancestry left such an outsized genetic footprint relative to its documented share of arrivals. Enslaved people from the Gold Coast region, whom British colonial planters referred to using the term Coromantee, developed a specific and well-documented historical reputation across Jamaica for organized resistance and rebellion, a reputation planters themselves recorded repeatedly and with genuine alarm in their own writings. Coromantee-led uprisings shaped Jamaica's colonial history repeatedly across the 17th and 18th centuries, including the significant slave rebellion known as Tacky's War in 1760, one of the largest and most sustained uprisings against British colonial authority anywhere in the Caribbean during this period. Nanny of the Maroons, one of Jamaica's most celebrated national heroes and the only woman to hold that official status, is widely believed to have been of Akan origin herself, leading sustained and ultimately successful resistance against British forces from the Maroon strongholds of Jamaica's mountainous interior. Some researchers studying the Gold Coast genetic mismatch have proposed that this well-documented pattern of organized resistance, community cohesion, and cultural leadership among Coromantee-descended communities may have contributed to a kind of creolization effect, in which later arrivals from other African regions were gradually socialized into an already dominant Akan-associated cultural framework already established on the island, a process that, over multiple generations, could plausibly help explain why genetic and cultural Gold Coast influence in Jamaica appears disproportionately large relative to the raw historical import numbers alone, though this particular explanation remains, like the others, an active hypothesis rather than a fully settled conclusion. If a story like this, where 200 years of trusted written history turns out to tell only half the truth once modern DNA gets involved, is the kind that stays with you, stay close, because the gap between what documents record and what biology actually preserves keeps turning up in one population's history after another. And if there is a specific island, community, or ancestry question you have always wanted checked directly against the real genetic evidence, leave it in the comments, because that is exactly where the next story like this one tends to come from.